A lot of public speaking, but I mostly talk about the economy. I talk about the financial markets. But a funny thing is, when I give these lectures, I get a lot of laughs, and a lot of people will refer to me as the stand-up economist. I don't know. I'm going to just go over some of the things I discuss, and we'll know in a few minutes the things that my audience has been laughing at all these years are actually funny. So one of the things I talk about a lot is the national debt. You guys are making this easy. So, the national debt is like $17 trillion. Right? And that's not the funny part. But anyway, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? We have the unfunded liabilities, the off-budget items are enormous, but let's just deal with the $17 trillion. Because I talk about the fact that there is no way that we're going to pay this money back. We just borrowed too much money, and the only question is how we're going to default. And the major economists, the mainstream economists, always say, look, Peter Schiff, you don't know what you're talking about. We don't have to pay the money back. And I'm thinking to myself, we don't have to pay the money back. I mean, we borrowed it. Have we discussed this with the lenders? Do the people who are loaning us all this money realize that we're not going to pay it back? I mean, for example, we have a lot of short-term debt. The maturity is very short. So in the next 12 months, about $5 trillion comes due. Right? You got to pay back $5 trillion. And they say, no, we don't have to pay it back. You see, we're just going to borrow that $5 trillion to pay it back. And so that's our plan. Right? The plan is we're going to borrow $5 trillion from the new investors to pay off the old investors. Yeah, that's the plan. Well, I mean, does anybody here know anybody else who kind of operated this whole business under that plan? Bernie Madoff. All right. Bernie Madoff. Right. The U.S. government runs a giant Ponzi scheme, and it's actually not just me saying that. Bernie Madoff, when he first went into jail, he gave an interview, and in that interview, Bernie Madoff said, "Why are you guys even talking to me? The federal government, the U.S. government, is running the biggest Ponzi scheme in the world." And of course, when that article came out, it was a big story. Immediately, the mainstream media, the economists were saying, "Well, come on, that's Bernie Madoff. He doesn't have any credibility. Who cares what he says?" Well, he's got credibility about one thing, right? Ponzi scheme. He knows the Ponzi scheme when he sees one. That's why, at the time, that's why I said we should have put Bernie Madoff in jail. We should have made him the Secretary of the Treasury. I'll give you a perfect example of why he would be a much better Secretary of the Treasury than our last Secretary, who was Timothy Geithner. If you remember, we had a debt crisis. It was in all the newspapers a couple years ago. The debt ceiling. We weren't going to raise the debt ceiling. Well, do you remember what Timothy Geithner said was going to happen if we didn't raise the debt ceiling? Right? He said we were going to default on our debt. If we couldn't borrow more money, we were not going to pay back any of the money we've already borrowed. Right? Now, see, Bernie Madoff would never say something like that. See, Bernie Madoff knows, I mean, this is basically Ponzi 101. When you're running a Ponzi scheme, you don't tell anybody that's a Ponzi scheme. You at least pretend that you're going to pay. You say, well, we're going to raise taxes, we're going to cut spending. You don't tell the bondholders that you're not going to pay. Now, I also talk a lot about the Federal Reserve, right? Now, quantitative easing?
Yes.
Right, you know what that is, right? It's a euphemism for inflation. That's all it is, right? But the Fed doesn't want to say that their monetary policy is to create inflation, because the people know enough to know that that's not a good thing, right? So when they first came out with QE1, now of course they didn't call it QE1 initially, they just called it QE. It's only QE1 because it didn't work, and so they did QE2. And that's how they do things in Washington. If it doesn't work, you just do it again. Right? And you just keep doing it, right? The definition of insanity. But when they announced QE1 or QE, and they finished it, I said, well, they're going to do another one, because I knew it wasn't going to work, right? I know that quantitative easing is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Right? It doesn't matter how much gas you put on, the fire is just going to get bigger, and so you're going to keep throwing more on it. So I said we'd have another one. Then sure enough, we had QE2. And then I was saying, well, we're going to have more QEs than Rocky movies. and so we did that.